I guess before I go any further, I just acknowledge my co-authors who've been helping me out greatly. So Matthew Gardner from AMP's been doing a lot of work down in the Liverpool Plains with the project. Kerry Bell, who's statistician with DAF, who does a fantastic job of putting up with me and working with unusual trial designs and difficult analyses. Nick Poole from FAR in Victoria, who's experienced in high yielding grain production. And obviously acknowledge GRDC and the federal government and growers, of course, for putting in the money that actually funds the work. So a little tiny bit more background. This project is running between 2012 and 2017. This coming year will be our second last year of experimentation. And we're aiming to try and produce better yields and less lodging under irrigation through agronomic means. Lodging is a big constraint to yield in irrigated systems. We're working in conjunction with a Better Irrigated Wheat germplasm project that's doing some pre-breeding to try and improve the genetics. And last year we ran some trials in Emerald, Narrabri, Spring Ridge and Gatton. I'm not going to talk about the Gatton trials today. I normally wouldn't have come this year to talk. I try and talk every second year, and I like to get 2 years of results before I update people on what's going on. But we got some quite interesting variety results last year that I thought people might want to know about because last year was different to previous years in terms of its weather patterns, and that caused some different lodging in varieties. So we trialled 18 varieties across 3 of those locations, Spring Ridge, Emerald and Narrabri. The varieties were all sown on 2 sowing dates and 2 N regimes. The trials are fully irrigated, but as with any irrigated farm, sometimes pumps break down and people get sick, and so they probably weren't perfectly irrigated, but it was a pretty good irrigation regime last year. And we use a comprehensive fungicide and insecticide program to make sure that biotic stresses don't limit yield. So we don't want any fungus or an insect stopping those varieties from achieving their potential. So I guess it's important to understand that some of these varieties have disease susceptibility issues that would need to be addressed with a chemical program on a commercial farm. And our target plant population is 100 plants per metre squared, calculated on the bed area, so we don't include the unsown furrow in that calculation. So the aim of our N regime is to get a very large amount of nitrogen on to make sure that nitrogen is not limiting to yield. And we generally do that in 2 ways, with an in-crop or delayed N regime, where we only really need about 70 kilos of N per hectare at sowing. That's combined soil plus fertiliser N. In the sowing N regime, we try and put most of that nitrogen up front, because we've shown in the past that the in-crop N regime does significantly reduce lodging and increase yield. And we've got a sowing date comparison that happened as well. And that comparison was early sown versus late sown, mid-May versus the end of May at Emerald and Narrabri, and a little tiny bit later for those 2 sowing dates at Spring Ridge. So I'd like to throw some cautionary notes at people. Varieties in agronomy perform differently between environments and years and farming practices. So I always encourage people, if they've seen something new and they want to try it on their farm, to try it on a small scale first. I find it a bit scary when I talk to a grower about in-crop nitrogen application and he's never tried it before and he wants to go and plant his whole farm to in-crop nitrogen. I say, well, just try it on one paddock first and get familiar with it so you understand the ins and outs of it. As I mentioned before, the disease-free trials, keep that in mind. Some of the varieties may be susceptible to diseases. And check on marketing options for these varieties too. There's 2 new varieties that we trialled last year from the southern markets, Cobra and Trojan. They did extremely well, but they're not being marketed in the north particularly. Ben might want to say something about that later, but understand how you're going to market them because their quality is still provisional. And so yes, we've got some different results to previous seasons, so we'll start talking about that shortly. I've started to try and characterise our irrigation experiments and seasons using something that I'm calling, for want of a better term, radiation degree days. So how much radiation, which is what the plants grow on, do you get per unit of temperature? And this is an important measurement because temperature makes the crops, higher temperatures make the crops flower faster, roughly speaking. The cooler temperatures you get for the same amount of sunny weather, the better your yield potential. So we're doing some analyses where we're looking at that trend of that ratio between radiation and thermal time over the season. So that's time progressing through the season, and that's the ratio of radiation to thermal time. And up the top, lines that get up the top are the cooler years where you're getting good sunny days and it's fairly cool weather. The lines that are down the bottom of the trends of the graph are the hotter years. So we've done this for 25 years worth of data, just to give us something to compare with. And it was quite interesting. I mean, 2013, for those of you who remember it, was a really hot, dry year. The season just went like that. Everything moved so quickly. Now, this data is just for Goondiwindi, but this trend is it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty well similar over, Narrabri, Gunnedah, Emerald. The shapes change a little bit, but generally speaking, the trend's the same. So 2013 was a really fast season, and we actually struggled to get much lodging in 2013. The lodging that we got was very late, often after physiological maturity before harvest. So we got data, but how good was that data? And we're sort of starting, the more trials we run, the better picture we'll get of that. 2014, however, was quite different, and it was quite cool at the beginning of the season. And these conditions are what we know produce greater lodging risk. We've shown relationships between the amount of what we call vegetative biomass, so the lush, thick growth that you get at the start of the season, lots of tillers, big fat leaves. This is what creates lodging risk because it weakens the stems of the plant and it weakens surface root systems. So those conditions are part of what contributes to high lodging risk. It's not the whole thing, but it's a significant part of it. So it was quite a different year to 2013 early in the season when that lodging risk is developing. And for comparison, there's 2008, which was the big lodging year that when a lot of people grew irrigated wheat that lodged. And that was the year that really kicked off this sequence of projects. And it's interesting that it wasn't a massively high lodging risk year early, but it did through the middle of the season. And this is another period when the crop's height is developing, and height is another thing that's related to lodging. The taller the plant, the taller the lever, the easier it is to go over. So, and the other thing that was in 2008, most growers had an awful lot of nitrogen in their soil. They were cotton growers who had a failed cotton crop or no cotton crop. They had massive amounts of nitrogen. So we'll keep running our experiments, and we'll keep trying to relate the trends in our experiments to the different years and just see what we can find out in terms of which years are creating the biggest lodging risk. Unfortunately, our N regimes didn't work last year. We had low N at sowing at all of the sites to 90 centimetres, but at Narrabri and Spring Ridge they were ultimately high fertility paddocks, and we had faba bean stubble in Narrabri, we had high organic carbon at Spring Ridge, and we didn't see a nitrogen response, particularly at those sites. There's a small inconsistent response at Spring Ridge and no response at all at Narrabri. And so even though we started with 70 units of N, which is our normal target, it was a good learning experience for us because we don't normally work on such high fertility paddocks. We're normally working on cotton paddocks where the cotton's pulled everything out of the system. And so we'll have to develop some new N regimes for that kind of paddock. At Emerald, so yeah, these sort of organic N sources are breaking down rapidly under irrigation, and the crops just aren't really responding to that early N differential. At Emerald, we also had 70 units of N shallow because we'd grown a forage sorghum crop to try and pull all the N out, but there was actually a fairly substantial soil N below 1.20 metre, and so we think the crop's accessing that pretty quickly, and again, we didn't get much of an N response. Anyway, enough on the N response. We didn't achieve our best practice N regime. We didn't get a significant effect at Emerald and Narrabri. So, hooking straight into some results. So what we've got here is a range of varieties. I'm feeling a bit intimidated with Alison Kelly in the room, a statistician from DAF. I forgot to put my I forgot to put my LSDs on the graph. The least significant difference on the yield graphs is about 0.5 tonne to the hectare. Lodging is really difficult to do a least significant difference because we often have to do what we call a square root transformation. So the LSD actually changes as the data gets bigger. So I've just thrown all this in there so Alison knows that I'm thinking about these things. Okay. But anyway, so let's look at the variety results because that's what this talk is really about, which varieties were doing different things last year. And what we saw was this new thing from Southern Australia, Cobra, did very well at Narrabri on both sowing dates. Crusader, which we know is a low lodging type, did well. Livingston and Marinda, which we also know are good MR lodging varieties. Sentinel, Sentinel, Suntop, Trojan and Wallop all did consistently well across both sowing dates. Now, the theory on lodging is that the earlier you sow, the more lodging risk you create because you give the vegetative phase longer to produce more biomass. So Narrabri matched up with that theory in that the early sowing date, this black line, tended to lodge more. So when I analysed the Narrabri data, I thought, beauty, everything's working out as we expect. But when we went to Emerald, however, just pointing out again that the lodging susceptible varieties are the ones that yield less. We do get pretty good correlations between yield and lodging, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. But Emerald really surprised me. We actually got the opposite trend at Emerald, where the early sown trial yielded more and lodged less than the late sown trial, and that I had to really get my head around that, and I'll go into a bit of detail in the paper in the book if you really want to I guess hear all of the possibilities that may have caused that trend. I'll talk about that again in a second, but just to go over the varieties again, similar varieties were doing well. So Cobra did well on the early sowing date, Caparoy did a bit better. Kennedy seems to really perform at Emerald and at Gatton. It really likes those hotter environments. We didn't get the same sort of yields at Emerald. It just wasn't quite as good an environment for us. Had a few establishment problems in the paddock. Mitch, Sentinel, Suntop, Trojan, Wallop did reasonably well on the early sowing date. Trojan not so good on the late sowing date. So similar kinds of trends in varieties. But what we saw at Emerald was, if we looked at the lodging progression after flowering time, so lodging is most important to measure during grain filling when the crop's still green, because that's when lodging really upsets light interception and it affects yield the most. And so these are the two sowing dates, and we've sort of overlapped the data a little bit to look at the relationship between lodging and flowering date on each sowing date. You can see that the late sowing date really got hammered by the lodging event, but that's the same lodging event on the early sowing date, if you know what I mean. So the same, we've overlapped the data a little bit to relate it to flowering. So that's actually the same lodging event. So what happens is the late sowing date, if you get a massive lodging event, the late sowing date is naturally going to cop it earlier in its life cycle. So if it's an important thing for us to understand, if we're going to sow late and the crops are going to grow further into our storm season, there's potentially a greater likelihood that those late sown crops are going to catch a big storm and lodge at an earlier growth stage. So that's really important for us to think about, and we may have to go and do probably a climate analysis to look at, you know, how many big rainfall events, what's the frequency of big rainfall events through spring, and is that probability changing through September and October, or is it the same? So it'd be interesting to know. So at Spring Ridge, we got some interactions between variety and N regime and sowing date. They were inconsistent. On the early sowing date, we saw the opposite trend to what we often see, where the sowing end for some reason did a little tiny bit better. But on the late sowing date, we saw what we usually see, and the delayed end strategy really helped us avoid lodging a little bit and yield better. And bear in mind that most of the varieties we were trialling were actually better suited to that late sowing date. So they are mainly the quicker varieties. So this was the trend that was probably more applicable to varietal maturity. And if I had the time, I would really go through and pick out those results, and I probably should compare the long season varieties sown on the early sowing date to the late season varieties sown on the late sowing date. That would be the most logical comparison to make. don't get too hung up on this graph. I like to do the statistically correct thing and show you the individual results, because there are interactions going on, but there's still a fairly consistent picture going on with certain varieties performing poorly and certain varieties like Trojan and Cobra performing very well. There's some big interactions going on here with this thing, Impala, which really seems to respond sometimes to this delayed nitrogen regime. So the sowing N on the late sowing date did a lot worse than the delayed N on the sowing date, but we didn't get the same response on the early sowing date. So what we really want to do in the next couple of years is cut down this set of varieties to the ones that are the really outstanding ones and start looking at them in more detail, so we have a better picture of exactly why we're seeing some of these responses. And this is the lodging for those varieties. This is lodging across the first 4 weeks of grain filling. So I've actually cut out the last 2 weeks of data for this particular graph, because the late lodging event came in and really it was very indiscriminate, and the error went up substantially if we included the late lodging data. So this was actually a better picture of what was... This data was better correlated to yield, and I should have put a different graph up to show that. So we saw again, Trojan and Cobra did well. Lancer did reasonably well, but it lodged. At Emerald, let's just go back to Emerald and just point out some of these things. So we had Lancer and Mitch and Wallop were 3 varieties that came out really well out of the first couple of years of testing, but we can see Lancer lodging at Emeralds, Wallop lodging, and Mitch lodging. So we saw very, very little lodging in those varieties in the first 2 years of the project, and we have seen lodging in these varieties last year, to a lesser extent in Narrabri, Mitch, Wallop, Lancer. But the other thing that surprised us last year was that Suntop, we didn't get much of a look at Suntop in 2013. And there was one trial where we got late lodging, and Suntop was one of the intermediate to worst lodged varieties in that particular trial, but it was a late lodging event, and Suntop did yield well. So we had a hard time figuring out what preliminary rating to give Suntop. Last year we've trialled Suntop, and it's actually been one of the least lodged varieties in all of our trials. And so that's good news, I guess, as long as that's going to be a consistent response. I'm just going to flip past that. So in summary, this is the table, it's in the book, of the percentage difference to the trial mean. So Cobra at Emerald on the early sowing date was 16% above the trial mean yield. So the white boxes are where they're more than 10% above, and the grey boxes are where they're more than 5% above, between 5 and 10%. So you can see that Cobra and Trojan did really well consistently across locations. One little blip there for Trojan, but in general they were very, very consistently high performing for yield across locations. So it's just our first year that we've looked at them, bear that in mind. Cobra's default quality classification in the north is APW, and just be aware that it is MS to S for stripe rust, both stripe rust path types. So, you know, if someone was going to have a go at it, you really got to keep an eye on the disease management. Trojan is only an ASW default in the north, and it's MS to S for yellow spot. Yellow spot can be pretty bad in a lodged paddock because lodging brings the crop closer to the ground, and yellow spot spreads through splash dispersion of spores, I understand. So we saw some bad yellow spot in one of our trials last year, in one of the Gatton trials, which I haven't shown here. On the off chance anyone wants to rush out and put in a paddock of Trojan and Cobra, you might want to know the maturity of them, because there's probably not a lot of data out there. And so at Emerald and Gatton, they were both falling as a mid-season type. They were sort of halfway between Kennedy and Gregory with their flowering response. At Spring Ridge, they tended to be quick maturing. They were similar to Marinda and Crusader. But at Narrabri, they were inconsistent, and I don't have time to go into the specific responses. If someone wanted to know how they went at Narrabri, I could get you that data later. So just be aware, varieties will interact with a year in terms of their flowering response. So this is just the first year we've seen these things. We build up a picture over time, we'll get an idea of how quickly they're going to flower. So the next three most consistent varieties were Mitch and Sentinel and Suntop. So they also perform quite well for yield, but not quite at the same level as Trojan and Cobra. But out of those three, Suntop is the only APH variety. But bear in mind, you know, Suntop we've only really had one really good year's worth of data on Suntop. But given that 2013 was a really low lodging year, got to wonder how good our data was in 2013, where we didn't get much lodging, and the lodging that we got was very late. And I'm starting to do analyses which show that that late lodging is not nearly as well correlated to yield as the lodging that happens earlier in grain filling. So we're not sure how good that data from 2013 is actually going to be in the end. So this is just a summary of the rating that the project has given all of those varieties based on the 3 years worth of data. It will be a little bit different, particularly to the New South Wales Variety Guide, because Peter Matthews has got data from the MIA, which is a bit different to ours, because these varieties have different flowering responses, and that's probably related to different lodging responses. So our aim over the next, so I guess I just go back and say, again, what we call G by E and by M, genotype environment interaction and also management interaction, can always throw a surprise. So we would love our varieties to perform the same every year, but you just can't guarantee what's going to happen if you get a completely different year. If we get a year that's right up, you know, super cool year all season, what's going to happen? Which variety is actually going to stand up the best? Now that we're collecting a bit of data, we're going to start doing some multi-year analyses and see just how bad that G by E by M is. Still feel that our varieties are going to perform relatively consistently for lodging, I hope, but we'll wait until the analyses come out before we make that call. So yes, over the next couple of years we're going to try and narrow down our variety set. We're going to really start looking at these MR varieties and see if we can tease apart the differences between them for lodging and yield potential. So by the end of the project, maybe some of these we might be able to move into the RMR category, but some of them might have to move this way as well. So there's a good solid base of varieties that are around about that MR mark that we've got to work with. So they're certainly a lot better than the varieties we were working with a few years ago that are quite lodging susceptible, although that might be a bit harsh on Gregory given its performance last season, so we'll see how we go. But I just remind people, varieties aren't a silver bullet when it comes to irrigated wheat production and reducing lodging risk. An MR variety is a good start, but that's all it is. You still want to use a sensible seed rate, 100 plants per metre squared on the bed area. And I keep talking about bed area because if you're getting a contractor in to sow a furrow irrigated paddock and you say, sow 50 kilos of seed to the hectare to give me that 100 plants per metre squared, well, if he sows 50 kilos to the hectare and he's not sowing anything in the furrow, what's he putting on top of the bed, which is 50% of the area? He's putting 100 kilos of seed on the bed, or he's doubling the plant population. So just something to keep in mind if you're a furrow irrigated farmer. Soil condition, unfortunately, plays a big role in terms of germination percentage and establishment. So you've still got to know your soil and know what your plant is going to do. But you want to end up with around, even between 50 and 100 plants per metre squared on the bed is pretty reasonable if you've got a little bit of nitrogen in your soil. Sorry? 2 minutes. Okay. Test for soil N. Understand what your soil N is before you go into an irrigated wheat crop. Are you dealing with a really high end soil? It's going to be a big lodging risk, and there are ways to manage that, but you want to know. If you can, ideally you just want to start with between 50 and 100 units of N at sowing and dribble the rest of the N on through the season. Plant growth regulators can help, particularly in a higher N paddock. So if you've got more than 100 units of N at sowing and you're trying to get more than 6 tonnes of wheat yield, then I would be recommending that you use plant growth regulators. So next steps, I've already talked a bit about this as I've gone through the presentation, but we're going to look harder at those MR varieties. We're going to start looking at the best management for some of those selected varieties. Really want to do an analysis for the agronomy conference later this year on just what is the relationship between grain fill lodging and yield, and compare that to final lodging score and yield, because that final lodging score I suspect is not terribly, certainly the preliminary analyses is, if you just go out and look at lodging at harvest time, that data is not going to be very well correlated with yield. It's what's happened through grain filling. How early did that crop start to lodge? That's the big issue we're finding. And we want to keep looking at the effects of seasonal trends on lodging risk. Throw a curveball into the equation. We've talked about lodging, we've talked about high yield, which varieties are best. But for someone who water is limiting and you've got lots of land, do you really want to be trying to get the maximum yield per unit of land? And I've been doing some economic analysis, and the answer is probably no, you probably don't. If you've got lots of land and a bit of water, you're better off spreading that water over a slightly wider area and aiming to try and get 5 or 6 tonne to the hectare on that area. And I've got some pretty extensive analysis on that people can come and get off me if they want, and there's a fair bit involved. But so again, we had a different year in 2014, we got some different results. Mitch and Wallop and Lancer lodged more than we had seen in previous trials. Just be aware that they can lodge, they're not a silver bullet. They're still fairly lodging resistant. Suntop did better than we expected, so it might be a good option in the long run in the north. And Cobra and Trojan had the highest yields and relatively low lodging. So yeah, very promising start for those two under irrigated conditions in the north. Again, acknowledge that the research was done with the support of GRDC and growers. And just always like to throw in a few pictures at the end. You know, this is why we don't grow Sunvale. And Baxter and Burke, you know, there's some very lodging susceptible varieties out there. So, you know, varietal choice, picking an MR to start with is a good start when you're growing an irrigated wheat paddock.